He
Get off her!
sprinted down the
Keep your hands
hospital
off me!
hallway,
Police!
heart pounding only to freeze at the doorway. His
Don't move!
fiancée was
Keep your hands
standing over
behind your
his
back, ma'am!
unconscious mother, pressing a pillow down with both hands. For a split second, he couldn't breathe. The woman he was about to marry was trying to kill the one person who loved him most. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? Ethan Miller had always been a man of schedules. His days ran on the clock, conference calls, deadlines, and the rhythm of a life too carefully measured. Yet that morning, as Boston lay under a low gray sky and the leaves of Beacon Hill gathered in quiet drifts along the brick sidewalks, his phone buzzed with a call that didn't fit anywhere in his calendar. It was from Massachusetts General Hospital. He almost didn't answer. He was standing by the window of his penthouse, coffee cooling beside a stack of proposals. But something, maybe instinct, maybe the echo of his mother's voice from long ago, made him pick up. The nurse on the line spoke softly, explaining that Maggie Miller had been admitted overnight with pneumonia. Serious but stable, she said. Ethan thanked her, hung up, and stood motionless. For the first time in years, the silence around him felt heavier than success. By the time he reached the hospital, the afternoon light had turned thin and pale. The scent of antiseptic filled the hallway, and every sound, the hum of machines, the shuffle of shoes, seemed too loud. When he pushed open the door to room 212, his mother lay small against the white sheets, her silver hair damp against her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she smiled, the same gentle smile that had once greeted him after every childhood game, every heartbreak, every mistake. "You shouldn't have come in the middle of your workday," she whispered. "Work can wait," Ethan said, pulling a chair closer. "You scared me, Mom." "I'll live." She coughed, then squeezed his hand weakly. "You've got your life. Don't make a fuss over mine." He wanted to tell her that his life had started with hers, that everything he'd built was because of her, the nights she stayed up sewing his school clothes, the mornings she packed lunches after double shifts. But the words stuck somewhere behind his throat. Instead, he adjusted her blanket and looked toward the window where the last of the daylight trembled on the glass. A nurse entered quietly. A woman in her early 30s with dark auburn hair tied back and a voice as calm as a lullaby. "Mrs. Miller." "Time for your meds," she said, then glanced at Ethan with a reassuring smile. "You must be her son." He nodded, standing. "Ethan Miller. Sabrina Callahan," she replied. "I'll take good care of her." The way she said it, simple, steady, without trying to sound kind, made him believe her. When the IV drip beeped faintly, Maggie murmured, "She's the only one who listens. Most of them rush in and out, but this one sits even when she doesn't have to." Sabrina blushed lightly, checking the chart. "That's what I'm paid for, Mrs. Miller." "No," Maggie said, smiling faintly. "That's what you were made for." Outside, a soft rain began to fall, blurring the lights of the city. Ethan found himself watching the nurse's quiet efficiency. The way she adjusted the oxygen line spoke to his mother and dimmed the harsh overhead lamp. Something about her steadiness reminded him of the calm he'd lost long ago. He stayed until visiting hours ended. When he finally left the room, Sabrina was still there, humming softly while changing the linens. He paused at the door and said, "Thank you." She looked up. "She's strong. You'd be surprised what a mother can survive." As he walked down the corridor, those words stayed with him, what a mother can survive. He didn't know yet how much they would come to mean. That night, the rain deepened into a steady drizzle that tapped against Ethan's windows. He couldn't sleep. Every few minutes he reached for his phone, tempted to call the hospital again, but stopped himself. At 2 a.m., he finally gave in and drove back the streets slick with missed traffic lights glowing like distant beacons. When he stepped into the ICU wing, the halls were hushed, the air cooler, almost reverent. Through the glass panel of his mother's room, he saw Sabrina sitting by the bed, reading aloud in a low voice. The sound carried faintly through the door, words about hope and healing from a dog-eared novel. Maggie's hand rested on hers, and though she was asleep, her breathing had steadied. Ethan stood there longer than he meant to, watching the quiet scene. For the first time in years, something in his chest softened. Success had given him everything except this, the sight of someone caring without expectation. Sabrina looked up, startled when she saw him. "You shouldn't be here after hours," she whispered, stepping into the hallway. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. Is she okay? She's holding on, Sabrina said. We almost lost her this morning. You must have good timing. He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. Thank you for staying. She shrugged. I didn't want her to be alone. There was a silence between them, not awkward, just heavy with everything unspoken, gratitude, fear, exhaustion. Then Sabrina glanced back toward the room. She talks about you when you're not here, she said softly. About how proud she is. About how she always knew you'd make something of yourself. Ethan looked down at the floor. Yeah, she never says that to me. She doesn't have to. Sabrina replied. Some people show love by worrying. That's just their language. He smiled faintly. And what's yours? Sabrina tilted her head. Listening, I guess. When he returned home an hour later, dawn was breaking over the Charles River. The city was quiet, washed clean by the rain. He brewed another cup of coffee but didn't touch it. Instead, he stood by the window thinking about his mother, about the nurse with the tired eyes, and about how fragile everything could be, how one phone call could remind you that love, no matter how neglected, never truly disappears. Before he left for the hospital again that morning, he placed his phone on silent and told his assistant cancel the meetings. Which ones, she asked. All of them, he said, and for once he didn't feel guilty. The night Boston changed, it wasn't with thunder or sirens. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask permission. Ethan Miller sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The skyline shimmered against the glass, each window below him, a tiny square of someone else's life. He had built empires out of deadlines and decimals, but tonight even the numbers refused to behave. A message blinked on his phone. Your mother's condition has worsened. Please come as soon as possible. For a full minute, he didn't move. Then without a word, he stood up, took his coat, and left. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and rain. By the time Ethan reached the 4th floor, the lights in the hallway were dimmed, the sound of footsteps softened by the hour. He hesitated outside room 414, his hand resting on the doorknob longer than necessary. When he finally pushed it open, the first thing he saw wasn't the machines. It was his mother's hand, small and pale against the white sheets. Maggie Miller, the nurse said gently, is a fighter. He looked up and met her eyes for the first time. She was young, maybe 30, with dark curls pinned behind her ears and eyes that seemed older than her face. Her name tag read, Sabrina Lee, RN. She's resting now, Sabrina said softly. We had a rough night, but she's stable. Ethan nodded, trying to swallow the tightness in his throat. Thank you. You're her son. Yes. Ethan, Sabrina smiled. She talks about you a lot. He blinked. She does. She says you used to draw houses on napkins when you were little. Said you were going to build her a mansion one day. He almost laughed. I built a few, just never hers. Sabrina's eyes softened. Maybe she doesn't need a mansion. Just a visit. It wasn't judgment, it was truth spoken gently enough to sting without wounding. Ethan nodded. I'll stay a while. Good, Sabrina said. She sleeps lighter when you're here. She turned to adjust an IV, her movements quiet and deliberate. Ethan sat down beside the bed. The monitor beeped steadily, a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. His mother's face looked smaller somehow, framed by the thin gray of her hair. He reached for her hand, hesitated, then finally took it. Her fingers twitched slightly. Ethan. I'm here, Mom. Her lips curved faintly. Took you long enough. He smiled through the ache. I got lost. You always do, she murmured, drifting back into sleep. Sabrina lingered near the doorway, watching the exchange. When their eyes met, she gave a small nod, the kind people give when they've seen something sacred and don't want to disturb it. Later, in the quiet of the hospital lounge, Ethan stared out at the city lights reflected in the window. He didn't feel like the man who owned them anymore. He felt like a stranger looking in. Sabrina passed by with a tray, paused, and said softly, There's coffee in the break room. It's terrible, but it's warm. He smiled faintly. That might be enough. She poured him a cup, then sat across from him. You've been here all night. He nodded. Can't sleep. Neither can half this floor. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't awkward, just honest. Sabrina glanced at him. You don't visit often, do you? He hesitated. I used to think showing up late was better than not showing up at all. And now? Now I'm not so sure. She smiled gently. You're here now. That counts for something. He looked at her and realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, without expectation, without agenda, without fear. Outside, the city kept glowing, but for the first time he noticed the spaces between the lights. The dark, the quiet, the parts people forget to look at. Morning came slow, wrapped in a fog that made Boston feel half asleep. The hospital cafeteria smelled like burnt toast and hope. Ethan carried 2 cups of coffee back to room 414. His mother was awake, her voice raspy but sharp as ever. You look like hell, she said as he walked in. Good morning to you too, she smiled weakly. You used to hate hospitals. I still do. So why are you here? He hesitated. Because I don't hate you. That earned him a quiet laugh, small but real. Don't get sentimental on me now. I missed you, he said simply. Her eyes glistened. You always did say the right thing, just 20 years too late. He winced, but her tone was kind. Sabrina entered just then, checking the monitors. You two sound like trouble already. Always have been, Maggie said. Ethan handed her one of the cups. Peace offering. Hospital coffee. Sabrina sniffed it, wrinkling her nose. That's not peace. That's surrender. He laughed, and so did Maggie. The sound startled him how easily it came. When Sabrina left to check other rooms, Maggie whispered, She's good for you. He frowned. Mom, I mean it. You're less stone around her. He didn't answer, but she wasn't wrong. That afternoon, Sabrina found Ethan sitting alone in the chapel on the ground floor. The small, stained glass windows spilled colored light across the pews. He looked up as she entered. Didn't peg you for religious, she said. I'm not, he admitted. Just trying to remember what it feels like to believe in something. She sat beside him. Belief isn't about certainty. It's about showing up even when it hurts. He glanced at her. You always sound like you've lived twice. Maybe I just listen a lot. He smiled faintly. You should teach that. I try, she said softly, but most people would rather talk. They sat quietly, the sunlight from the stained glass turning their faces blue and gold. Somewhere above, the faint sound of a hymn drifted down the hall. Not a choir, just a recording, but it filled the space like something alive. Sabrina said, Your mother told me you used to play piano. He looked up. She told you that? She said you quit after your father left. He nodded. Too many keys, not enough answers. You should play again, she said. Why? Because sound can forgive what words can't. He turned that over in his mind long after she left. That night, as the city lights blinked outside his window, Ethan sat beside his mother again. She slept soundly, her hand resting in his. The paper crane Sabrina had left earlier sat on the nightstand, its shadow trembling in the glow of the monitor. Ethan whispered, You always said light finds its way through cracks. Maybe it's true. His mother stirred slightly, murmuring something he couldn't catch, a name maybe, or a prayer. He sat back, eyes stinging, and realized the strangest thing. He wasn't afraid anymore. The light coming through the blinds was soft and fractured, cutting the room into quiet pieces. He looked around at his mother, at the crane, at the fading trace of Sabrina's perfume in the air. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stranger in the light. He felt seen. The air in Boston had begun to change. Late September sunlight slanted low through the buildings, catching on the river, painting the city in copper and smoke. It was the kind of afternoon that made even time seem tired, slower, softer, hesitant to move forward. Ethan Miller parked outside Massachusetts General and sat in his car for a long moment, listening to the engine tick itself quiet. He wasn't sure why he hesitated anymore. The hospital had become part of his daily orbit, morning visits, phone calls to the doctors, the smell of disinfectant clinging to his clothes. Still, every time he walked through those sliding glass doors, he felt like a man stepping into confession. Inside, the corridors hummed with the usual low chorus monitors, beeping voices murmuring behind curtains, wheels squeaking against polished linoleum. He passed the nurse's station where Sabrina was leaning over a chart, her pen tapping lightly against the clipboard. She looked up, saw him, and smiled, that quiet, steady smile that had a way of lowering the temperature in the room. She's awake, Sabrina said softly. Better than yesterday. Thank you. She's been asking about the garden again. You should take her before the weather turns. Ethan nodded, guilt prickling at the edges of his chest. I keep meaning to. Meaning's overrated, Sabrina said gently. You just do it. He didn't answer, but her words followed him down the hall. Maggie Miller's room smelled faintly of lavender. Sabrina's doing, no doubt. His mother was propped up on pillows, her hair brushed a light blanket over her knees. The television was off. She preferred silence now, or at least the illusion of peace. You're late, she said, without looking at him. I brought muffins, he said, holding up a small paper bag from the bakery near her house. Her eyes softened. Blueberry, your favorite. Flattery won't erase the clock, she teased. He smiled faintly and sat beside her bed. For a few minutes, neither spoke. They just listened to the beeping monitor, to the world moving somewhere outside their window, to the way memory sometimes crept in without warning. You were gone a long time this time, she said finally. I was working. Her eyebrow lifted. Still chasing the same dragons. He sighed. It's not that simple. It never is. She murmured, her voice distant. That's why we make it complicated. He wanted to argue, to explain how things weren't like before, how he'd built a life that required all of him. But the words died somewhere between his chest and his throat. Do you remember the house on Pine Street, she asked suddenly. He blinked. Of course I do. You used to sit on the porch and count the cars that went by. You said everyone was taking someone somewhere better. He smiled faintly. That sounds like me. It was, she said, always looking ahead, never realizing how much you already had. The silence between them deepened, not sharp, not cold, but weighted with the things neither of them had said in years. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? For not coming sooner, for not knowing how. Her hand found his frail, but warm. You're here now, that's how. He looked down at their joined hands, at the fine blue veins beneath her skin, and something in him broke quietly. That evening, after she drifted off, he walked down to the hospital cafe. It was nearly empty, just the hum of the coffee machine and a man reading the newspaper by the window. Sabrina sat at a corner table chart in front of her, a cup of tea growing cold. You look like you could use something stronger than coffee, she said when he joined her. Depends on the day. Rough one, he shrugged. She's better. Talking more. That's good. Yeah, He trailed off, searching for the right words. There's so much we didn't say, and now every minute feels borrowed. Sabrina nodded slowly. That's how it is. People wait until it's almost too late to talk about the things that matter. He stared into his cup. And when it is too late, then you love them louder in the silence. Her voice was soft, but it landed heavy. He looked up, meeting her eyes, steady kind, unflinching. And in that quiet cafe surrounded by humming machines and the smell of burnt coffee, Ethan realized something strange. He wasn't afraid of silence anymore. Not when it came from someone who understood it. The next morning dawned gray and heavy. Rain tapped lightly against the hospital windows, a slow rhythm that felt like breathing. Maggie was awake early, watching the drops trace paths down the glass. Remember when you used to draw faces in the fog on the window? She asked as he walked in. He smiled. And you'd scold me for smudging the glass. I'd scold you for pretending you couldn't see the mess, she said, smiling. You always liked pretending. He sat down beside her, their reflections merging faintly in the window. I still do. I know, she said gently. You think pretending keeps you safe, but it just keeps you alone. He looked at her, wanting to deny it, but her eyes were steady. I wasn't always a good mother, she said suddenly. I was young, angry, scared. Your father was gone too much, and I built walls. You learned from me. He shook his head. You did what you had to. No, I did what I thought I had to. There's a difference. The rain thickened, blurring the city beyond the window. You know, she continued softly. You and I, we speak the same language. Silence. He smiled sadly. That's not much of a legacy. It is, she said. If you learn to translate it. Sabrina entered, then brightening the room like she always did. Morning, you two philosophers. How's my favorite patient ready to run a marathon? Maggie said. Sabrina laughed. Good, I'll bring your sneakers. Ethan watched the way they spoke, light, familiar, natural. It struck him how easily Sabrina could make his mother laugh, how she somehow filled the spaces between their words without even trying. After Sabrina left to check another patient, Maggie said quietly, "She reminds me of someone who you, before the world taught you to hide." He looked at her, startled. "You used to smile like that," she said. "Like life still surprised you." He swallowed hard. "I don't know when I stopped." "Then start again," she whispered, "before it's too late." Later that day, Ethan walked through the hospital garden alone. The rain had stopped, leaving everything shining: benches, wet puddles glinting like silver mirrors. He sat beneath a maple tree, the same one his mother could see from her window. He took out his phone, opened the photo app, and scrolled board meetings, conference tables, anonymous hotel rooms. 1,000 images of a man living efficiently and meaninglessly. Then, buried deep in the gallery, he found one picture, old, slightly blurred. Him as a boy sitting beside his mother on a wooden porch, both laughing at something just out of frame. He stared at it for a long time. Sabrina's voice echoed in his memory. "You love them louder in the silence." He didn't know what that meant yet, but for the first time he wanted to learn. That evening, back in the hospital room, Maggie was asleep. The paper crane Sabrina had folded yesterday sat on the nightstand. Ethan reached for it, turning it over in his hands. It felt fragile, like a secret meant to be passed on. He placed it beside her, then whispered into the quiet, "I love you, Mom." She didn't stir, but her lips moved slightly as if answering something he couldn't hear. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to change the air. Outside, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, forgiving. By late October, Boston had turned into a painting, the kind that time forgets to fade. Maple trees spilled color like fire, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and wet leaves, and the afternoon light seemed to linger just a little longer before saying goodbye. Ethan used to love autumn. It was the season of deals, new projects, and deadlines. But now, driving toward Massachusetts General, every morning he found himself noticing different things: an old man feeding pigeons at the park, children kicking leaves into the air, the way the sky turned to honey near sunset. He hadn't slowed down like this in decades. The hospital, oddly enough, had become a refuge. The world outside buzzed and shouted, but inside those walls life moved at a different rhythm, steady, deliberate, fragile. When he stepped into his mother's room that morning, sunlight was spilling across the sheets. Maggie was awake, her hair silver against the pillow, her face pale but alive with mischief. Sabrina stood by the bed, her dark curls catching the light, folding a small square of paper with the precision of someone who had done it many times. "Hold still," Sabrina said, smiling. "You're about to meet your new roommate, a paper crane named Marvin." Maggie chuckled, the sound rasping but warm. "Marvin? I expected something classier, maybe Clarence. You can rename him once he's born," Sabrina teased. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching the two women, one who had given him life, the other quietly giving it back. He hadn't seen his mother laugh like that in months. When Maggie noticed him, she waved a trembling hand. "Well, look who remembered he has a mother," he grinned. "Don't start. I brought you flowers. Unless they come with chocolate, I'm unimpressed," she said, but her smile softened as he placed a small bouquet on her table. Sabrina glanced up. "He's improving, Mrs. Miller. Last week it was store-bought lilies. This week, hand-picked daisies. Next week, maybe poetry." "Careful," Ethan said. "You'll raise her expectations." "I think they're already raised," Sabrina said, and the way she said it, light but kind, made him smile for reasons he couldn't explain. That afternoon passed in stories. Maggie, revived by company, began reminiscing about the old house on Pine Street, the one with the crooked porch and the leaky faucet Ethan had promised to fix and never did. "You were 6 when you tried to build a fort out of cardboard boxes," she said. "You thought you'd invented architecture." "I still think I did," he said. "You built it in the rain," she reminded him. "Every empire starts with mistakes," he said, and she laughed until she coughed. Sabrina adjusted her pillows, quiet but attentive, then slipped out to bring tea. Ethan sat by his mother's bed, holding her hand. Her skin felt thin like parchment, but her grip was steady. "I like her," Maggie said softly. "Sabrina, yes. She listens like someone who's been hurt and still believes in people." He glanced toward the door. "She's good at what she does. She's good at who she is," Maggie corrected. He didn't answer, but he thought about it for a long time. When Sabrina came back, the smell of chamomile filled the room. Tea for two and one skeptic who still thinks he's immortal. Maggie laughed. You know my son too well. Ethan smiled, feeling strangely lighter, as if the world had loosened its grip just a little. Later that evening, after Sabrina left, he stayed behind. The room was dim now, bathed in the soft blue of the city lights outside. Maggie had fallen asleep, her breathing slow, her hand resting in his. On the bedside table sat the paper crane, Marvin or Clarence or whatever name his mother would decide later. Its wings were slightly uneven, one folded tighter than the other. It was imperfect, and somehow that made it beautiful. He picked it up and turned it over. On the inside flap, written in small, neat handwriting, was a message: "Hope doesn't vanish. It folds." He smiled. He didn't know if Sabrina had written it or if it was just something his mother had come up with, but it felt true. He tucked the crane into his coat pocket. Days turned into weeks. The hospital began to feel less like a place of sickness and more like a strange kind of home. Ethan brought books for his mother to read. She made him promise to try cooking something other than takeout. Sabrina sometimes joined them for lunch breaks, bringing sandwiches and stories from the other wards. Funny small things that reminded them that life kept going. One afternoon, Sabrina invited Maggie to the hospital garden for fresh air. Ethan pushed her wheelchair along the narrow path lined with maple trees that had already shed half their leaves. "Look at this," Maggie said, reaching out toward the air. "It's raining gold." Sabrina smiled. "Best kind of rain." They stopped by a small bench overlooking the Charles River. The wind picked up, tugging gently at Maggie's scarf. Ethan tucked it around her shoulders. "You used to bring me here," she said to him. "You'd chase the ducks and I'd sit under that big oak tree pretending to read while keeping one eye on you." He smiled. "You always pretended not to worry. That's what mothers do," she said. "We pretend so our children can be brave." Sabrina glanced at Ethan, her expression soft. "You two talk like poetry." "Poetry is just truth with rhythm," Maggie said. "Then your family must have been a whole orchestra," Sabrina replied, and they all laughed, a sound bright enough to make the air feel warmer. That evening, Ethan walked Sabrina to the parking lot. The air had turned crisp, their breaths visible in the glow of the streetlights. "You stayed late," he said. "So did you." He smiled. "I guess we're both bad at leaving." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the shimmer of city light. "You ever think about how strange it is," she said quietly, "that sometimes we meet the right people only when we've stopped looking?" He hesitated. "Maybe that's when we're finally paying attention." She nodded. "Maybe." They stood there, the silence stretching, not heavy, not awkward, just full. Then Sabrina said goodnight and walked away. Her footsteps soft against the pavement. Ethan stood watching her go until she disappeared around the corner. The next morning, Maggie was waiting for him with a mischievous smile. "So when's the wedding?" he groaned. "Mom, don't mom me. You're glowing like a schoolboy. I'm not. Oh, please. I may be old, not blind." He shook his head, laughing despite himself. "You're impossible." She leaned back against the pillow, smiling. "I just want to see you happy, Ethan. That's all I ever wanted." He took her hand. "I'm trying." "I know. And I'm proud." The room fell quiet. Outside, sunlight poured through the window, hitting the paper crane on her bedside table. Its shadow danced across the wall like a bird caught between flight and stillness. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan realized he didn't mind the quiet anymore. It wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Weeks later, Boston's Autumn Street Fair filled the city with laughter. From the hospital's upper floors, the lights below looked like stars that had fallen to earth. Families walked hand in hand. Musicians played on every corner. Sabrina convinced Maggie to watch from the balcony. They shared hot cocoa wrapped in blankets while Ethan stood behind them, smiling at how his mother's laughter mingled with the city's hum. "You see," Maggie said, raising her mug, "life doesn't end. It just changes rooms." Ethan looked at her, memorizing the lines on her face the way the lights reflected in her eyes. "I'll remember that." "I hope you do," she said softly. "Because someday when the light slows down for you too, you'll understand love doesn't disappear. It just waits for you to notice." The wind picked up, swirling a few golden leaves through the air. They landed in Maggie's lap and she laughed again. Sabrina reached over, brushing one gently from her blanket. For a moment it was all so simple, three people sharing warmth against the chill of the world. And somewhere deep inside him, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. The first snow of December came quietly drifting across Boston, like a sigh that nobody heard but everyone felt. The city slowed down, as if it too needed to breathe. The sidewalks turned soft and white, and the Charles River froze in streaks of silver light. Even the taxis seemed to move slower, their tires whispering against the snow. From the 20th floor of his apartment, Ethan watched it all through the glass, a world muted and calm, a city that looked peaceful only because he couldn't hear it. He had lived most of his life that way, watching from behind walls of glass. Meetings, dinners, speeches always there but not really in them. But now his world had shrunk to one room on the 4th floor of Massachusetts General Hospital. Every morning he carried something small with him, a thermos of tea, a magazine, or a scarf his mother used to wear when he was a boy. He never came empty-handed anymore. Somewhere along this way he'd realized that silence could be softened if you filled it with gestures. That afternoon Maggie's room was warm, a small oasis against the chill outside. The window looked out over the courtyard where snow gathered on empty benches. Inside, a small radio played something old Ella Fitzgerald, maybe just loud enough to remind them that the world outside still had music. Sabrina was already there, adjusting an IV line with practiced calm. Her hair was tied back, but a few loose strands fell over her face as she worked. She had that quiet steadiness Ethan had come to rely on, the kind you didn't notice until everything else fell apart. Maggie smiled when she saw her son. "There's my handsome boy," she said, her voice faint but teasing. "You look tired." "I'm fine," he lied, taking off his coat. "You're the one in the hospital bed." "Then we're both in trouble," she murmured, but her eyes twinkled. Sabrina laughed softly. "She's been giving me orders since breakfast." "I'm allowed," Maggie said. "I've earned the right to boss people around." They talked like that for a while, light, easy, the way families do when they're trying to pretend everything's normal. Ethan watched them and felt something loosen inside him, like a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. When Maggie finally drifted off to sleep, Sabrina stayed by the window, gazing out at the snow. Ethan followed her eyes. "You like the cold?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "Not the cold, the quiet." He looked at her. "The quiet can be cruel, or kind," she said. "Depends what you listen for." The words hung between them, weightless but full. He wanted to ask what she listened for, what she heard in the hum of the machines, the soft footsteps in the hallway, the sound of the world turning slow. But she turned to him with a small smile and said, "You should rest. You've been here every night." He shook his head. "I don't like the silence at home." "Then maybe it's not silence you're afraid of," she said gently. That made him pause. Outside, snow kept falling, not fast, just steady, patient, the way forgiveness moves through a heart. The next morning, sunlight came sharp and cold. Maggie was already awake, humming to herself the same hymn she used to sing when Ethan was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. "You remember this one?" she asked, smiling. He nodded. "I remember you holding me until the thunder stopped." Her hand reached for his. "You always needed proof that the dark wouldn't last." "I still do," he said. Sabrina came in with a tray. "Breakfast for my favorite patient," she announced cheerfully. "And for her overprotective son, black coffee, no sugar, because apparently you like suffering." Ethan smiled. "You're not wrong." They ate together, the room bright with the smell of oatmeal and peppermint tea. Maggie teased Sabrina about her cooking. Sabrina teased Ethan about his tie, and for half an hour the world outside didn't matter. Afterward, when Maggie dozed again, Sabrina and Ethan found themselves in the lounge near the window, cups of lukewarm coffee between them. The courtyard below glittered in the sun. A child was dragging a sled across the snow, her scarf fluttering behind her like a flag. "She reminds me of my sister," Sabrina said softly. "You have a sister, had." Ethan turned to her. She didn't look at him. "She was younger," Sabrina continued. "Always laughed too loud, talked too much. We grew up near a lake upstate. Winters were long but beautiful. The year she died, the lake froze early. She went out on the ice before I could stop her." He waited, letting her speak. When the ice broke, she said, her voice almost a whisper. It was so quiet afterward. "I think that's when I started listening for the quiet, like maybe it would give me something back." "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. She smiled faintly. "Grief doesn't need apologies, just company." He looked out the window again. You found a way to live with it. Some days, she said. Some days it still finds me. He understood more than he wanted to admit. After a long silence, she said, Your mother talks in her sleep sometimes. He glanced over. She does names. Daniel, Anna, Callahan. I don't know who they are. The name struck something deep in him like a faint chord from another song. Callahan, he repeated. She nodded. Do they mean anything? He hesitated. No, maybe just old family friends. She didn't push. Sometimes old names hold heavy stories, she said softly. That night, Ethan stayed later than usual. The hospital quieted down after 9, the air heavy with that particular stillness that only comes when people sleep beside machines. He sat in the dark by his mother's bed watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. She looked peaceful, but her hand twitched once like she was reaching for something unseen. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, Danny, don't go. Ethan froze. Mom, he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, half dreaming. Oh, I thought you were someone else. Who's Danny? She looked at him for a long moment and something unreadable passed through her eyes. Sorrow, maybe, regret. Not tonight? Sweetheart, she said softly, let's just be here. He nodded though the question stayed. When she drifted back to sleep, Ethan stood by the window looking down at the city. Snow was falling again, the streets below glimmering like veins of light. Somewhere he could hear the faint hum of a distant train, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. He realized he didn't know half of his mother's past. For all her stories, there were gaps, small silences she'd skipped over like stepping stones. And suddenly he wanted to know. He looked at her sleeping form, at the gentle rise and fall of her chest, and thought of all the times he'd been too busy to ask, too proud to listen. He pressed a hand against the glass. It was cold, grounding. We're not done talking yet, he whispered. Outside, the city glowed beneath a veil of snow. The flakes fell slow and patient, each one erasing a footprint, softening the edges of the world as if forgiving it for being too sharp, too cold, too human. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone in the silence. He felt something else, something that sounded faintly like hope. Boston had folded itself into winter. The city wore a soft hush beneath the snow. Cars moved slower. Footsteps vanished in white silence, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and salt from the bay. Ethan had grown used to this soundless rhythm, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Every morning he parked in the same spot outside the hospital, brushed the snow from his coat, and walked through the revolving doors carrying something, small flowers, a new scarf, a thermos of tea. He was never empty-handed anymore. That week Maggie's room had changed. A small Christmas tree sat in the corner, its branches thin but cheerful, draped with lights and mismatched ornaments that Sabrina had found from the staff lounge. There was an angel on top glass, delicate, almost glowing. Ethan had placed it there himself. When his mother saw it that morning, she smiled through tears. You still remember what matters, she said. He sat by her bed. You taught me to. She reached for his hand, her fingers thin but warm. Your father said once that you'd be the kind to remember everything except to rest. He smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. Sabrina entered quietly, her cheeks pink from the cold. Her scrubs were soft gray today, her ponytail loose, small strands escaping to frame her face. She carried a tray of food that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Breakfast. Mrs. Miller, she said brightly. Oatmeal, but I added a little sugar. Don't tell the doctor. Maggie grinned. My secret's safe with you. Ethan watched them, something tender rising in his chest. The way Sabrina leaned close to fix a blanket, the way Maggie's tired face softened, it reminded him of what real care looked like. When Sabrina stepped out to check another patient, Maggie turned to her son. She's a good one, that girl. She reminds me of someone. Ethan looked puzzled. Who? Someone from long ago. A family that used to live down the street. Callahan, I think. There was a girl, maybe 7 or 8 then. Big brown eyes, always helping her mother bring in groceries. I lost touch after the accident. What accident, he asked. She grew quiet. It doesn't matter now. People disappear sometimes and life moves on. He wanted to ask more, but her eyes drifted shut, weary from the effort of remembering. That afternoon, as the light turned gold, Sabrina came back with a small vase of holly branches, A little color for the room, she said. Christmas deserves red and green. Ethan helped her arrange them on the table beside the tree. You always find ways to make this place feel like home. She smiled softly. Maybe that's my job. He shook his head. No, your job is keeping people alive. This is something else. Their eyes met for a second too long. Then she looked away, pretending to fuss with the vase. Everyone needs something to believe in, Mr. Miller. He wanted to tell her that he was starting to believe in her, but the words caught in his throat. When Maggie fell asleep that night, Sabrina dimmed the lights. Only the small tree glowed, the angels shimmering faintly above them. She's been dreaming more, Sabrina said quietly, talking in her sleep. Ethan frowned. About what? About the past, she said. She keeps saying names. Daniel Anna Callahan. Ethan froze. That's your name. Sabrina's eyes flickered. I know. Coincidence? Her voice wavered. I wish it were. Before he could ask, a call echoed from the hallway. She hesitated, then whispered, Not tonight, please. After she left, Ethan sat in the dim light staring at the small tree. Outside, the snow fell endlessly quiet, pure, relentless. Inside, the glow of the angel flickered like a heartbeat. And beneath it all, one thought kept circling his mind like the turning of a slow wheel. What if the past was closer than he ever knew? The storm came without warning that night. Thick snow hammered the city, muting every sound. The hospital felt like a ship floating through a sea of white, distant, self-contained, the hum of machines its only compass. Ethan stayed late, reading aloud from an old book of short stories while Maggie dozed. Her breathing was steady at first, then uneven. She murmured something, a name. Callahan, she whispered again and again until her voice cracked into a quiet sob. Mom, Ethan said softly, taking her hand. It's just a dream. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed but aware. You look like him, she murmured. Like who? Daniel Callahan. He stiffened. Who is Daniel Callahan? Her lips trembled. Your father's brother. He stared, stunned. Dad never had a brother. Yes, he did, she whispered. They stopped speaking after the accident. What accident? Tears slid down her cheeks. The one that took Anna Daniel's wife. He blamed your father for it. Your father blamed himself, and I... Her voice broke. I tried to keep them both from drowning in guilt, but one of them left. The other stayed, but not for long. He felt his chest tighten, a hollow ringing in his ears. Why didn't you ever tell me? I wanted you to remember your father kindly. I wanted to keep your world clean. Before he could answer, the monitor began to beep faster. Sabrina appeared in the doorway, her expression instantly alert. What happened? She asked, rushing to the bedside. She's remembering things Ethan said, things about my father and about you. Sabrina checked Maggie's pulse, then met Ethan's eyes. We need to keep her calm. Maggie reached weakly for Sabrina's wrist. You were there? Sabrina froze. Ethan turned sharply. What does she mean? Sabrina didn't answer. She leaned close, whispering something in Maggie's ear. The older woman relaxed her breathing, slowing the lines in her face, softening again. When the crisis passed, Ethan stood motionless. The machines beeped steadily again, but the quiet between them felt heavier than any storm. Tell me, he said, his voice low. What is she talking about? Sabrina shook her head. Not now. You keep saying that. His tone cracked. Why can't you just tell me the truth? Because she deserves peace before you deserve answers. He stepped back, the words cutting deep. You sound like you know what it feels like to run from the past. Her eyes glistened. Maybe I do. The snow beat harder against the window. Ethan turned away, chest heaving. I just want to know who I am, Sabrina. You're her son, she whispered, and that's enough for tonight. When she left the room, she dropped something without noticing, a photograph face down on the floor. Ethan bent to pick it up. It was the same picture she'd shown him before, a woman holding a little girl near a lake. But now, under the lamp's light, he noticed what he hadn't before. In the distance near the dock, a man stood watching them. His face half hidden, but unmistakable. His father. His knees weakened. The world seemed to tilt, sound draining away. He sat back in the chair, clutching the photo. The snow outside had softened to flakes again, falling steady and endless. Somewhere deep in the quiet, he could still hear his mother's voice echoing, You look like him. He didn't know which him she meant anymore, his father or the man standing in the picture. The dawn came pale and exhausted. The world outside gleamed white, untouched. But inside, Ethan felt everything shift. The line between past and present had cracked wide open, and through it poured memories, questions, and the unbearable weight of truth. The morning after the storm, Boston woke under a blinding light. The snow, untouched, turned every street into a mirror. For a moment, the city seemed purified, as if the night before had never happened. But inside Ethan, nothing felt clean. He hadn't slept. The photograph lay on the table beside him, its edges damp from his hands. He had turned it over again and again until the truth refused to be ignored. That man in the background, his father. And that woman, Sabrina's mother. The thought gnawed at him through the night. Every memory, every conversation twisted to fit around it. The way Sabrina had looked at his mother, the way she'd flinched when Maggie said Callahan. It wasn't coincidence. It was history, his, hers, theirs. When he entered the hospital that morning, he moved like a man half there. The corridors hummed with morning routine nurses exchanging shifts, the smell of fresh coffee, the squeak of carts on linoleum. But to him, everything sounded distant, muffled, like hearing the world through glass. He paused outside his mother's door. Through the window, he could see her sitting up, sunlight spilling across her blanket. Sabrina stood beside her, checking her vitals, calm as always. The sight made his chest tighten, not with anger, but with something heavier, older. When he stepped inside, both women turned. "You're early," Maggie said with a smile. "Come to rescue me from oatmeal again?" Ethan forced a laugh. Something like that. Sabrina's eyes flicked to his. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then she turned back to the monitor. "Everything looks good today," she said, her voice too even. "If she keeps improving, the doctor might discharge her before Christmas." "That's good news," Ethan said quietly. "Yes," Sabrina replied. "It is." The air between them was thick with unspoken things. Maggie, sensitive as ever, noticed. "You two look like you're hiding secrets," she teased. Sabrina smiled faintly. "Nothing dramatic, I promise," but her eyes said otherwise. Later, when Maggie dozed off, Ethan followed Sabrina into the hallway. The window at the end looked out over the frozen Charles River. Sunlight glittered on the surface like glass shards. He took the photo from his pocket and held it out. "You dropped this." She froze. "You kept it." I looked closer this time. His voice was quiet but steady. "That's my father, isn't it?" Sabrina's breath caught. "Ethan, don't lie to me." She closed her eyes. For a long time, the only sound was the soft hum of the hospital's heating system. Then she said, "Yes, that's him." He stared at her, his heart pounding. "So tell me what this means." Sabrina hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "It means your father wasn't the only one who left something unfinished. My mother, Anna Callahan, was his sister-in-law, the woman who died in the accident your mother mentioned." He felt the world tilt again. "You're Daniel Callahan's daughter." She nodded. "And the accident that killed my mother. It wasn't just an accident." Ethan's voice broke. "What are you saying? The car your father was driving, he was taking her home that night? There was ice on the bridge. They say he tried to swerve. He survived. She didn't." He swallowed hard. Eyes burning. "My father killed your mother." "No," she said quickly. "He didn't mean to. He carried that guilt until he died. And so did Maggie. That's why she recognized my name the day we met." Ethan pressed a hand to his forehead. She knew. Yes, she knew who I was from the start. He leaned against the window, the world spinning behind the glass. Why didn't anyone tell me? Sabrina's eyes filled with tears. Because forgiveness doesn't always need an audience. They stood in silence, the weight of generations pressing between them. Outside, a siren wailed, faintly distant, fading. "I became a nurse because of her," Sabrina said finally. "I wanted to save lives where one was lost. When I met your mother, I didn't plan to stay, but she reminded me of what my mom used to say, love doesn't vanish, it just changes hands." So I stayed. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and saw not a stranger tied to tragedy, but a woman who had turned pain into purpose. He wanted to hate her, but couldn't. The world had already punished them both enough. That night, the snow returned light and steady, drifting through the city like falling ash. Ethan sat by the window of his apartment, watching it blur the skyline. He hadn't turned on the lights. The only glow came from the streets below, where Christmas decorations shimmered faintly in the dark. He kept hearing her voice, calm, steady, heartbreakingly sincere. Your father wasn't the only one who left something unfinished. He poured a glass of whiskey, though he barely touched it. The amber light trembled in the glass like something alive. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of his family's silence, decades of love guilt and half-truths that had built his life on quiet fractures. When the phone rang, he almost didn't answer, but the caller ID said, "Hospital. Mr. Miller." It was Sabrina's voice, softer than usual. "Your mother's asking for you." He was out the door before she could say more. The roads were slick, the city ghostly. By the time he reached the hospital, the snow had turned to sleet. Inside, the halls were dim, the overnight staff moving like shadows. Maggie was awake when he entered, propped against her pillows, eyes bright with the strange clarity that comes before confession. Sabrina stood at her side, silent, watchful. "Mom," Ethan said, stepping closer. She smiled faintly. "You found out?" He nodded, unable to speak. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I kept it from you because I wanted you to remember your father kindly. He wasn't a bad man, Ethan. Just broken. We all were." He sat beside her, taking her frail hand in his. "You should have told me. I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it." Her eyes flicked toward Sabrina. "And maybe I was waiting for her too." Sabrina looked down, tears glinting. Maggie continued, voice trembling. "When she came here, I knew who she was. I thought it was fate giving us one more chance to set things right. I just didn't know how." Ethan's throat tightened. "So you let me walk in blind?" "I let you walk in free," she said softly. "Because I knew once you learned the truth, you'd carry it, and I wanted you to live a little before you did." For a long time, no one spoke. The monitors hummed snow, tapping gently against the window. Then Maggie reached for Sabrina's hand. "You forgave me long before I earned it." Sabrina shook her head. "You saved me first. You gave me a place to belong again." Maggie smiled. "Then we're even." Ethan couldn't stop the tears that came. They weren't loud or dramatic, just quiet, constant, the kind that felt like release. Maggie squeezed his hand. "Promise me something, Ethan. Anything. When I'm gone, don't let this story end with grief. Let it end with grace." He nodded, his voice breaking. "I promise." Sabrina wiped her eyes. Maggie leaned back, her breathing shallow but calm. "You both have the same look," she murmured, half dreaming, the one people get when they finally see the whole picture. As the night deepened, Maggie drifted into sleep. Ethan and Sabrina sat in silence, the air heavy but somehow clean. The kind of quiet that follows truth, not before it. When Ethan finally looked up, he saw the snow outside reflecting the hospital's light, each flake glinting like tiny absolutions. He whispered more to himself than anyone, "Maybe this is what forgiveness feels like." Sabrina nodded, her eyes soft. "It's lighter than guilt, but it lasts longer." They stayed there until dawn, the three of them bound not by blood or blame, but by the fragile, unbreakable thread of understanding. Outside, the first hint of morning touched the snow. Inside, peace, the kind that takes a lifetime to find, finally settled in. Winter lingered longer than anyone expected. By late January, Boston still looked like a watercolor of pale blues and silvers, its streets dusted in quiet melancholy. The holidays had passed, but their ghosts remained, wreaths on doors, twinkling lights left up too long, and the faint echo of a world trying to feel joyful again. Ethan's world had grown quieter since his mother's passing. The morning she slipped away had been peaceful, a calm breath after a long storm. Her hand had rested in his light as a memory, and she'd smiled before she went. No fear, just release. The nurse said she'd gone like someone who'd already forgiven the world. He remembered the last words she spoke clearly. "Don't let this story end with grief." So he tried. But grief is a stubborn house guest. It doesn't leave just because you tell it to. It lingers in the corners, in the scent of her scarf, the sound of the clock she used to wind, the faint trace of her handwriting on recipe cards. Most mornings, Ethan found himself at her favorite diner, the kind that still served coffee in chipped mugs and played Frank Sinatra over the static of a small radio. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, didn't ask questions. She just poured his coffee and said, "Your usual?" He always nodded. It was there in that diner with the cracked red booths and the smell of bacon grease that Sabrina found him again. She stood in the doorway, her winter coat still dusted with snow, her eyes uncertain but warm. "You look like a man who's been thinking too much," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "You could say that. Mind some company only if you like cold coffee." She laughed, that soft, genuine sound that always managed to make the room feel brighter. She slid into the booth across from him. "You haven't answered my texts. I didn't know what to say. Try hello." He looked up, and for a moment he saw in her the reflection of all the years that had led them here, the shared losses, the forgiveness neither of them had asked for, but both had needed. "Hello," he said finally. She smiled. There. That wasn't so hard. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the radio and the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. It was a comfortable silence, one born not from avoidance, but from understanding. "I went to the cemetery yesterday," Sabrina said after a while. "I left flowers, red ones. She always liked red." Ethan nodded. She would have appreciated that. "She forgave me before I forgave myself," Sabrina said softly. "That's something I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You already have." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, deliberate, almost tender. "Funny thing about grief," he said quietly, "it doesn't end, it just changes shape." Sabrina looked out the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. "So does love," she whispered. Weeks passed. The city thawed. Snow melted into the gutters, the Charles River cracked open under sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of spring. Life, in its quiet way, insisted on beginning again. Ethan decided to sell his penthouse, the glass cage he'd once thought was success. He moved back to his mother's old house in Cambridge, the one with the crooked porch and the oak tree that leaned just enough to touch the window. The first time he stepped inside, the air felt still, like it had been waiting. Dust danced in the shafts of light. Her quilt was still folded neatly on the couch. The clock ticked on the mantel, slow, steady, patient. He didn't change much, just fixed the leaky faucet, painted the kitchen walls a pale blue, and left everything else as it was. It wasn't a shrine. It was a home again. Sometimes Sabrina came by after her hospital shifts. She'd bring soup or pie from the diner, and they'd sit on the porch with coffee, watching the neighborhood kids play in the street. One evening, as the sunset bled across the sky, Sabrina said, "You ever think about what forgiveness really means?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Every day." She turned to him. "And it means you stop wishing the past were different," he said slowly. "You just wish it peace." She nodded, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "Then I think your mother would be proud." He looked out at the horizon, the faint gold turning to dusk. "She already is. I can feel it." A breeze moved through the trees, soft and cool. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour. For a moment, everything felt still. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for silence, only presence. Sabrina rested her head against his shoulder. "You think it's possible," she murmured, "for two people who met through loss to build something new?" He smiled, his arm wrapping gently around her. "I think it's the only kind of love that lasts." They sat that way as the stars began to appear, slow, deliberate, patient, just like healing. Later that night, Ethan found himself standing in the living room, looking at an old photo on the mantel, his mother young and bright-eyed, standing beside his father in front of that same porch. Someone had scribbled a note on the back in faded ink. "Home is not where you live. It's who you forgive." He traced the words with his thumb, a tear slipping down his cheek, not of sadness, but of recognition. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of early spring and the faint echo of a woman's laughter, the kind that sounded like sunlight breaking through the clouds. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt at home. And somewhere deep in that quiet, he could almost hear his mother's voice again, soft, steady, full of peace. "You didn't just save me, Ethan," it seemed to say. "You saved yourself." The rain had long stopped by the time Ethan and his mother sat together on that quiet terrace, the city fading into dusk. The lights below shimmered like scattered memories, some bright, some dim, all alive. In that silence, no grand words were spoken. There was only the sound of two people breathing the same air again after years of distance. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive with music. It comes like the soft hum of a heart learning how to forgive. Ethan finally understood what his mother had spent her whole life trying to teach him, that love isn't a transaction or something we earn through success. It's what remains when the noise fades. It's the simple act of showing up even when we've failed before. Like an old porch light that keeps burning through the night, love waits quietly, trusting that someday someone will find their way back home. The story reminds us that unconditional kindness can change the course of a life. Every person, no matter how far they've wandered, deserves a place to belong, a family, a voice, a second chance. True wealth isn't measured by what we own, but by who sits beside us at the dinner table when the world grows quiet. And maybe that's the heart of it all. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's choosing to stay open despite the pain. It's like the old hands that still set the table every Sunday, or the neighbor who leaves an extra pie by your door because they know you've had a hard week. The smallest gesture can bridge the widest distance. So tonight, if you're listening, let this story linger a little longer in your heart. Think about the people you haven't called, the words you've left unsaid, the love you might still have time to give. And if this story touched you, leave a 1 in the comments to let us know it reached your heart. If you think it could be better, press 0 and tell us why. Because every story, like every person, deserves a chance to grow. Like that single light glowing in a kitchen window at dusk, kindness, steady, ordinary, and patient, can guide us all the way home.